She already took the money. Now she was taking the house, while I was still in uniform. I hadn't even put down my duffel before her lawyer shoved divorce papers into my chest, smirking like he'd just won a prize fight. Full custody of the assets, spousal support. He called me kid as he walked away. Like 10 years of combat didn't matter. But then I walked into the bank and found she'd emptied every account, even the one in my name. She stole everything, left me with $17 and a truck I'd rebuilt with my grandfather. But that wasn't the only thing he gave me. Turns out, the envelope she didn't know about? That was mine too, and it was loaded. But before we begin, let me know where in the world you're watching from today. It's always fascinating seeing who's joining us from around the world. My name is Daniel Rourke, and I'm 34 years old. After a decade in the Army, I've learned that discipline and hard work are the only things a man can truly count on. My wife, Camilla, who I met right before enlisting, used to share that belief. Or at least, I thought she did. The simple brick house we bought together sits quiet most days, while she runs her consulting business from the spare room. Our calls had gotten shorter during my last deployment, her voice carrying a new edge I couldn't quite place. My boots click against the airport terminal floor, heavy with the weight of coming home. In my pack, there's an old fireproof envelope my grandfather gave me years ago, his weathered hands pressing it into mine. "Keep this safe, Danny," he'd said. "Someday, you'll need it more than you know." But let me start from the beginning. I pulled into our neighborhood around 2 in the afternoon, the Texas sun beating down hard enough to make the air shimmer above the asphalt. After 15 hours of travel, my uniform felt like it was grafted to my skin, but I didn't care. I was home. You know that feeling when everything familiar starts coming into view? The Hendersons' crooked mailbox, old Mrs. Parker's rose bushes that never quite survived the summer heat, little landmarks that tell you you're almost there. Then I saw the car in my driveway. It wasn't Camilla's practical little Civic. This was a gleaming black Mercedes, the kind that probably cost more than I made in a year. My stomach did a slow roll as I parked behind it, dust from the road settling around my truck. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a man who looked like he'd just walked off a lawyer billboard. Expensive suit, perfect hair, and a smile that reminded me of the coyotes we used to chase off the ranch. All teeth and no warmth. "Daniel Rourke?" He adjusted his tie like he was about to close a business deal. "Perfect timing. I'm Brent Halverson, your wife's attorney." My wife's attorney. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stayed in the truck for a moment, one hand still on the wheel, trying to make sense of what was happening. "Come on now, kid," Halverson called out, tapping an envelope against his palm. "I've got places to be." Kid. I'd led men through combat zones, but this slick bastard was calling me kid. I got out slowly, my boots crunching on the gravel. "What's this about?" My voice came out steadier than I felt. He thrust the envelope at my chest. "Consider yourself served. Mrs. Rourke filed for divorce 3 weeks ago. Given your extended absence, the court granted us permission for alternative service 3 weeks ago, while I was still deployed, while I was still calling her, still planning our future. The envelope felt like it weighed 100 pounds. She's requesting full custody of the assets," Halverson continued, clearly enjoying himself. "Spousal support, of course, though I should mention she's already exercised her right to secure her portion of your joint accounts." He glanced at my truck. "You can keep that, by the way. Consider it her generosity." My hands were shaking now, but not from fatigue. "Where is she?" "Mrs. Rourke is not obligated to speak with you directly." He pulled out his phone, barely looking at me anymore. "All communication goes through my office. You have 14 days to respond." His smile widened. "Welcome home, soldier." I watched him slide back into that fancy car, watched him pull out of my driveway, like he'd just delivered a pizza instead of destroying my life. The Mercedes disappeared around the corner, leaving nothing but exhaust and the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. You ever have a moment where the world just stops making sense? Where everything you thought you knew turns out to be built on sand? I stood there in my own driveway, still in my combat boots and uniform, holding divorce papers I never saw coming. Later that night, though I couldn't tell you exactly when, I found myself sitting on the front porch steps. The same steps where Camilla and I used to watch summer storms roll in, where we'd talked about kids and growing old together. A beer sat unopened between my hands, collecting condensation in the humid evening air. The cicadas were singing their usual chorus, but for the first time since I could remember, the familiar sound brought no comfort. The next morning hit like a hangover, even though I hadn't touched that beer. I pulled into the bank's parking lot right as they opened, my stomach already knowing what I'd find. The young teller's face said it all before she even pulled up my accounts. "I'm sorry, Mr. Rourke," she said, fingers hovering over her keyboard. "The joint accounts were accessed 2 weeks ago. The remaining balance is," she squinted at the screen, $17.32. 2 weeks ago. While I was still ducking mortars in a desert halfway around the world, Camilla had been methodically dismantling our life together. The checking account, savings, even the emergency fund we'd built up over years of careful planning. All of it, gone. "What about the personal account?" I asked. "The one in just my name?" More clicking, more frowning. "That one shows a withdrawal of $12,000 on the same date. The authorized user was Camilla Rourke," I finished. Of course, I'd added her to that account before my first deployment, just in case something happened to me. Trusted her with everything I had. You know what burns worse than being betrayed? Realizing you handed them the knife yourself. I left the bank with my $17 and a hollow feeling where my pride used to be. My phone buzzed. Travis, my buddy from high school, checking in. He'd heard through the grapevine about Camilla's surprise, as people were calling it. "Got a trailer out back of my place," he said when I called him back. "Nothing fancy, but it's got power and running water. It's yours if you need it." An hour later, I was following Travis's pickup down a dusty road on the edge of town. The trailer looked exactly like what you'd expect. Faded aluminum siding, plastic chairs out front, window AC unit humming like it was on its last legs. But it was shelter. And right then, that's all I needed. "Previous tenant left some furniture," Travis said, unlocking the door. "Might want to air it out a bit, but—" He shrugged, handed me the key. "Stay as long as you need, brother." The inside smelled like old cigarettes and forgotten dreams, but I'd slept in worse places. I dropped my duffel bag on the sagging couch and started making lists in my head. Find work. File a response to the divorce. Figure out how to rebuild from scratch. The security job came through a guy Travis knew. Graveyard shift at a warehouse across town, watching cameras and making rounds. The pay was barely enough to keep gas in my truck, but it was something. And the quiet night hours gave me plenty of time to think. Sometimes, too much time. Every night, driving to work, I'd pass our house. My house. The windows were always dark now, the flower beds I'd helped plant starting to wilt. Once, I saw Camilla's car in the driveway. Some fancy SUV I'd never seen before parked beside it. I kept driving. The letters from Brent started showing up at the trailer about a week in. Each one was wrapped in expensive letterhead. Each one designed to twist the knife a little deeper. But it was the one about my pension that finally got to me. "Given your limited career prospects and modest military retirement," it read, "Mrs. Rourke's request for substantial spousal support seems more than reasonable. After all, she supported your career choices for years. Perhaps this is an opportunity to return the favor. My career choices: 10 years of service, 3 combat deployments, and this snake in an Italian suit made it sound like I'd been off playing soldier while Camilla suffered at home. I crumpled the letter and threw it in the trailer's tiny trash can, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. That spark of anger I'd been carrying since the driveway? It was growing into something hotter, something that demanded action. But what could I do? I had 2 weeks to respond to the divorce filing, no money for a lawyer, and barely enough left in my account to keep the lights on in this borrowed trailer. The cicadas started their nightly chorus outside my window, and I remembered something my grandfather used to say: a man backed into a corner's got 2 choices: give up or get creative. I wasn't ready to give up, not by a long shot, but time was running out, and creativity wouldn't mean much without a plan. I couldn't sleep. The trailer's AC unit rattled like it was chewing rocks, and my mind kept spinning through everything I'd lost. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up trying and decided to look for my spare truck keys. Figured I might as well organize what little I had left. Digging through my duffel bag, my fingers brushed against something cold and familiar. An old brass key with electrical tape wrapped around the head. The sight of it stopped me cold. It was the key to my footlocker, the one I'd stored in Travis's garage years ago when Camilla said it was cluttering up the house. You ever get that feeling where your whole body knows something's important before your brain catches up? That's how it felt holding that key. I threw on my boots and walked across Travis's yard in the dark. His garage was one of those oversized metal buildings that collect everything from broken lawn mowers to forgotten memories. The air inside was thick with dust and motor oil, reminded me of helping my grandfather work on his old Ford when I was a kid. The smell of grease and leather always hanging in the air. The footlocker was right where I'd left it, shoved behind some boxes of Christmas decorations. The lock was stiff from years of disuse, but the key still turned. Inside, under my old dress blues and some deployment photos, was exactly what I'd been trying to remember. A fireproof envelope wrapped in yellowed plastic. My grandfather had handed it to me just before he passed, right after Camilla and I got married. "Keep this safe," he'd said. "Someday, you'll need it more than you know." Back then, I'd just nodded and tucked it away, too caught up in newlywed life to really think about it. Sitting there on Travis's concrete floor, I carefully pulled the envelope from its sleeve. The paper inside was crisp, official-looking. My hands started shaking when I read the first line. Deed of property. 4 acres in central Texas, purchased with money I'd inherited from my parents' life insurance. The date showed it was bought before I'd even met Camilla, but that wasn't what made my heart skip. Below the deed was another document, a notarized clause Camilla had signed during our 2nd year of marriage, back when we were dreaming about building our future together. The legal language was clear as day. Any improvements or developments made on that land would remain solely mine, regardless of our marital status. We'd done it as a formality back then, something the bank wanted before they'd discuss construction loans. My hands were trembling so bad I could barely read the rest, but one detail jumped out like a flare in the night: the property's location. It was the same piece of land where Camilla had built her new business coaching office 6 months ago, while I was deployed. The memory hit me like a punch to the gut. She'd mentioned it in one of her rare video calls. Just a small renovation project, nothing major. What she hadn't mentioned was that she'd taken out a business loan using our joint assets as collateral. I sat there in the dark garage, surrounded by the musty smell of old cardboard and forgotten tools, staring at those documents like they were written in gold. The clause was simple, but its implications were nuclear. If any development on that land was legally mine. My pulse was pounding in my ears. For the first time since coming home to Brent's smirking face, I felt something other than helpless rage. This wasn't just paper. It was leverage. Real, legal leverage. But I only had 14 days to respond to the divorce filing. The clock was ticking, and Brent's law firm had resources I couldn't match. One wrong move, one missed deadline, and this advantage would slip away like everything else. I carefully returned the documents to their envelope and sealed them back in the plastic sleeve. The weight of them in my hands felt different now, less like a memory and more like ammunition. Dawn was breaking by the time I walked back to the trailer. The morning air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass from somewhere down the road. For the first time in weeks, I had something solid to hold on to, something they couldn't take away with a signature or a drained bank account. The next morning, I drove out to the property. My grandfather's old survey markers were still there, rusted metal stakes driven into the ground at each corner. The land itself wasn't much to look at, mostly scrub brush and mesquite trees, but location was everything. It sat right where two major roads were scheduled to intersect, something Camilla must have figured out while I was deployed. And there it was, right in the middle of my inherited acres, her small renovation project. Small was a joke. She'd built what looked like a miniature corporate headquarters, all gleaming glass and modern angles. The sign out front read, "Rourke Consulting. Transform your future." The irony wasn't lost on me. You know that feeling when you're playing poker and suddenly realize you're holding better cards than you thought? That's how I felt standing there, watching people in business casual drift in and out of a building that, technically, belonged to me. I took pictures of everything: the building, the property lines, the sign, made sure the timestamps were clear. Then I headed to the county courthouse to pull records. Sure enough, there it was, a business loan application with our joint accounts listed as collateral. Camilla's signature was on every page. Not once had she mentioned the scale of what she was building, or where the money was coming from. For the next week, I lived at the law library. Ever tried reading family court cases for 12 hours straight? It's about as fun as digging fence posts in July. But I kept finding precedents. Cases where inherited property remained separate from marital assets. Cases about improvements made to non-marital land. Every ruling felt like another round of ammunition. The smell of old books and printer ink became my constant companion. Made me think of my grandfather's study, the way he'd spend hours going over cattle lineage records, making sure every detail was perfect. Details win wars, he used to say. Now I knew what he meant. Filing pro se, representing myself, wasn't my first choice. But with Camilla draining our accounts, hiring a lawyer wasn't an option. Besides, sometimes the best person to fight for you is yourself. I'd learned that much in the Army. The day of the hearing, I walked into that courtroom wearing the only suit I owned. Brent was there in something that probably cost more than my truck. He shot me that same smirk he'd worn in my driveway, like this was all some kind of game to him. Camilla sat next to him, wrapped in designer confidence. She wouldn't look at me directly. Funny how someone can share your bed for years but can't meet your eyes in court. She kept checking her phone, probably messaging clients about empowerment or whatever buzzwords were trending that week. "Your Honor," I said when it was my turn, "I'd like to present evidence regarding separate property assets." My voice was steady, even though my heart was hammering against my ribs. I handed over the documents, the deed, the notarized clause, the photographs, everything. The judge took his time reading. In that silence, I watched Brent's face change, first confusion, then something closer to concern, as he leaned forward to whisper to Camilla. Her perfect composure cracked just a little, a quick blink, a slight shift in her chair. "Mr. Halverson," the judge said finally, "did you review these property documents during discovery?" Brent cleared his throat. "Your Honor, we weren't made aware." "That's not what I asked, counsel." I stayed quiet, letting the moment work for me. Sometimes the best strategy is just to stand your ground and let others realize they've lost their footing. "Given these findings," the judge continued, "I'm inclined to consider the property and its improvements as separate from marital assets. Mr. Rourke, you'll need to file a formal motion detailing your claim to any business operations conducted on the premises." Camilla's phone slipped from her hands, clattering on the wooden bench. For the first time since I'd come home, she looked actually scared. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt something I hadn't in weeks. Like I could breathe again. Like maybe, just maybe, the scales were starting to balance. I had a long way to go, but I wasn't empty-handed anymore. The court notice arrived on a Tuesday morning. Just a single sheet of paper. But it might as well have been made of lead, for how heavy it felt in my hands. Motion dismissed due to procedural deficiency. The words blurred together as I read them again and again, trying to make sense of what went wrong. A formatting issue. That's what it came down to. All those hours in the law library, all that research, tossed aside because I'd failed to double-space some paragraphs or whatever technical rule I'd missed. Brent had found his loophole, and the judge had no choice but to follow procedure. You ever have one of those moments where the world just stops? Where everything goes quiet, and you can hear your own heartbeat like thunder in your ears? That's what happened when I set that notice down on my kitchen table. The same table where I'd spread out all my evidence, my photographs, my grandfather's envelope. They were all still there, mocking me now. Travis called that evening. His name flashed on my phone screen 3 times before going to voicemail. "Hey man, just checking in. Haven't heard from you in a few days." I let the message play out without moving from my spot on the couch. The next morning, he tried again. And the next. Each time I watched the phone ring until it stopped. What was I supposed to say? That I'd failed? That all my careful planning had amounted to nothing because I couldn't figure out how to format a legal document properly? Days started bleeding together. I'd go to work, stand guard in that empty warehouse, come home to Travis's trailer, and stare at the pile of papers on my table. They'd become like some kind of shrine to my failure. Every time I looked at them, I remembered Brent's smirk, Camilla's relief when the judge announced his decision. Remember that feeling I mentioned before? The one about holding good cards? Turns out I'd been playing Go Fish while they were dealing Texas Hold'em. Amateur hour at its finest. A week into my silence, I barely recognized my own reflection. The security job had me working nights, sleeping days, existing in some kind of twilight zone where meals didn't matter, and showers were optional. The old me, the soldier, the ranch hand, the man who believed in fixing what was broken, felt like a stranger. It reminded me of my first week of basic training, when everything felt impossible and giving up seemed like the only sensible option. But back then, I had drill sergeants who wouldn't let me quit. Now I just had an empty trailer and a box of useless papers. That's what I did with them, finally. Grabbed a cardboard box from behind Travis's garage, dumped everything inside, the deed, the photos, the court documents, even my grandfather's envelope. Couldn't bear to look at them anymore. Each piece of paper felt like evidence of my own stupidity, thinking I could go up against a professional lawyer and win. The box went into the closet with a thud that echoed my mood. I shut the door hard enough to rattle the trailer's thin walls. Standing there in the silence that followed, I felt hollow, like someone had scooped out everything that made me who I was, and left behind just enough to keep breathing. Travis's truck pulled up outside. I recognized the sound of his engine cutting off, the crunch of boots on gravel. He'd probably gotten tired of my ignored calls and decided to check on me in person. I didn't move from my spot by the closet, didn't turn on any lights, just stood there in the growing darkness, wondering if it was possible to feel more pathetic than I did right then. My grandfather's words echoed in my head. You don't quit just because the fence is harder to mend than you thought. But what did he know? He'd never had his whole life pulled out from under him like this, never had to watch everything he'd built get torn down by people who treated it all like some kind of game. The box sat in that closet, heavy with the weight of my failure, while Travis's footsteps approached the trailer door. Travis didn't give up easily. I'll give him that. He stood at my door, knocking with the patience of a man who'd grown up breaking horses. "Come on, Dan. I know you're in there. Your truck's outside, and I can see your shadow through the window." I sighed, feeling like a sulking teenager. When I finally opened the door, Travis took one look at me and whistled low. "Jesus, buddy. You look like something the coyotes dragged in." "Thanks for the pep talk," I muttered, but there wasn't any real heat in it. "Get cleaned up," he said, crossing his arms. "We're going out." "Travis, I'm not really—" "Wasn't asking." He settled his weight, looking exactly like he used to before a high school football game. 30 minutes. I'll wait." You know those moments when fighting seems more exhausting than just giving in? This was one of them. I showered, shaved, and put on clean clothes for the first time in days. The face in the mirror looked a little more human, at least. Travis drove us downtown to some place called The Stallion. It wasn't my usual scene, all polished wood and fancy cocktails, but Travis said the bourbon was worth it. As we walked in, the smell of leather seats and expensive cigars hit me like a wall. "Little rich for our blood, isn't it?" I asked. Travis shrugged. "Sometimes you gotta see how the other half lives." We were heading for the bar when I heard it. That laugh. The same smug chuckle that had followed me down the courthouse steps. Brent Halverson sat at a corner table, tie loose, face flushed. He was holding court with some young guy in an equally expensive suit. My feet stopped moving. Travis bumped into me, then followed my gaze. "We can go somewhere else," he offered quietly. But something kept me rooted. Maybe it was the way Brent gestured with his drink, spilling drops of amber liquid, or how his voice carried just a little too loud, like men do when they're trying to impress someone. "Let's sit there," I said, nodding to a booth behind him. The highbacks would hide us completely. Travis raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. We slid in, and I positioned myself where I could hear every word. The waitress came. We ordered beers. Brent's voice drifted over, getting louder with each drink. "These country types, they never check the details," he was saying. "Half the time they can't even read the fine print." The young guy laughed nervously. "But the construction permits—" "Please." Brent's voice dripped contempt. "You think I waited for permits? Client needed that office built fast, so I cleaned up the loan papers a bit. Made things happen." My hand wasn't quite steady as I reached for my phone. Travis saw what I was doing and shifted slightly, blocking any view from the bar. "You mean you forged them?" The young guy sounded impressed and scared at the same time. "Let's say I expedited the process." Brent's laugh again, looser now. "Changed some dates, adjusted some numbers. By the time anyone could check, the building was up and running. That's how you win, kid. You don't wait for the system." My phone's screen showed the recording time ticking up. Every word captured clear as day. But if someone found out, who's gonna find out? The husband? Another wet chuckle. Guy can barely file a motion properly. Probably still trying to figure out what hit him. The young lawyer's voice dropped lower. "Still, if the Bar Association—" "Relax. Documents are clean now. Originals got lost in a unfortunate filing accident." I could hear the ice cubes clink as he finished his drink. "Besides, client's happy, judge is happy, I'm happy. That's all that matters in this game." My beer sat untouched, condensation pooling around the base. Travis watched me, his face carefully neutral as the recording continued. Brent kept talking, each word another nail in his own coffin. Finally, he and his companion stood to leave. I kept my head down, phone still recording, as they settled their tab. Only when the door chimed behind them did I stop the recording and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Travis leaned forward. "You got all that?" I nodded, my hands shaking slightly as I played back the first few seconds. Brent's voice came through perfectly, every damning word preserved in digital clarity. "What are you thinking?" Travis asked quietly. I stared at my phone, at the audio file that had just changed everything. My chest felt tight, but for the first time in weeks, it wasn't from despair. The next morning hit me like a freight train. I hadn't slept much, kept replaying Brent's words in my head, hearing that arrogant laugh. You know that feeling when you're holding something explosive? Like every movement has to be perfect? That's how I felt clutching my phone on the drive downtown. The courthouse looked different this time, less intimidating. The marble steps didn't seem quite so steep. Inside, the air conditioning hit my face with that familiar institutional chill, reminding me of all those hours I'd spent here getting nowhere. I found the clerk's office tucked away on the first floor. The woman behind the counter, Betty, according to her nameplate, had kind eyes behind reading glasses that hung from a beaded chain. "How can I help you?" she asked. "I need to know if an audio recording would be admissible in family court." My voice came out steadier than I expected. "It's evidence of legal misconduct." Betty's eyebrows lifted slightly. She gestured to a chair beside her desk. "Let's talk about what you have." I played her a short clip. Her expression shifted from professional interest to something sharper. She held up one finger and made a phone call, speaking in low tones I couldn't quite catch. 20 minutes later, I was sitting across from Sarah Chen at Legal Aid. She listened to the whole recording twice, taking notes in tight, precise handwriting. "This is serious," she said finally. "He's admitting to multiple felonies. We need to file immediately." She looked up at me. "Are you ready for what comes next?" The old Dan might have hesitated, but I wasn't that guy anymore. "Yes, ma'am, I am." We spent the next 3 hours preparing the motion. Sarah knew exactly how to frame it. Criminal misconduct, fraud, ethical violations. We attached everything: the deed, the notarized clause, and a certified copy of the audio file. "Emergency hearing," Sarah muttered, typing furiously. "Given the nature of the evidence, yes, they'll have to grant it." She was right. By 2 o'clock, we had a hearing scheduled for 4. Just like that. I sat in the courthouse cafeteria, trying to force down a sandwich. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and my coffee had gone cold. Remember how time moves weird when you're waiting for something big? Those 2 hours felt like 2 years. Finally, we filed into courtroom C. The familiar wood panels seemed to absorb all sound. I spotted Camilla first, wearing one of her power suits, looking confused about the emergency summons. Then Brent strutted in, that same old smirk on his face. He barely glanced my way. Judge Martinez entered, and we all rose. She had that no-nonsense look I remembered, but today it seemed focused, right on our table. "Your Honor," Sarah began, "we have evidence of serious misconduct relating to the Rourke divorce proceedings." Brent's smirk widened. "Your Honor, this is clearly a desperate—" "Mr. Halverson," the judge cut in, "you'll have your turn." She nodded to Sarah. "Proceed." The audio file started playing through the courtroom speakers. At first, there was just bar noise, glasses clinking. Then Brent's voice, clear as day, cleaned up the loan papers a bit. I watched his face change. The smirk vanished. His eyes went wide, then narrow. When he heard himself say "forged," he actually flinched. Camilla's reaction was something else entirely. She turned to stare at Brent, her face draining of color. All that confidence, that certainty she'd had about winning, it crumbled right there in front of me. The recording finished. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush coal into diamonds. Judge Martinez removed her glasses slowly. "Mr. Halverson, would you care to explain?" Brent stood, straightened his tie. "Your Honor, that recording is clearly taken out of context." "The context," Sarah interrupted, "is fully documented in our motion, along with evidence of the original deed and notarized clause regarding property rights." The judge held up her hand. "I've heard enough." She looked directly at Brent. "I am immediately suspending your license to practice law, pending a full investigation. Bailiff, please contact the State Bar Association." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Brent's mouth opened and closed like a fish on land. Camilla pressed her hands against her face. I sat very still, watching it all unfold. Strange thing was, I didn't feel the satisfaction I'd expected, just a quiet sort of certainty that justice was finally showing up for work. The next few days hit like a Texas tornado. Every morning brought fresh headlines, each one worse than the last. I'd flip through the local paper at Travis's kitchen table, sipping coffee that never seemed to get cold fast enough, watching my old life dissolve in black and white. "Prominent divorce attorney disbarred," screamed Tuesday's front page. The article detailed how Brent's license was yanked faster than a loose tooth. The State Bar Association moved like lightning once they got their hands on that recording. Seems Brent had a history of creative paperwork that finally caught up to him. "You see this?" Travis asked one morning, sliding his phone across the table. It was Brent's law firm website, or what used to be his website. Nothing but a plain statement about his immediate departure and some corporate apologetics about maintaining the highest ethical standards. I remembered how he'd lounged in that leather chair, calling me kid, while he explained why I should just roll over and take it. Now his name was being scraped off the office door like old paint. But that was just the beginning. By Thursday, the dominoes really started falling. Camilla's consulting business got hit with lien violation notices. Turns out building on restricted land with forged documents tends to catch up with you. The county assessor's office froze her accounts pending investigation. You know that feeling when you're watching storm clouds gather, and you can feel the pressure change in your bones. That's what it was like watching her carefully crafted image crumble. Her social media went dark first. All those polished posts about empowerment and living your best life vanished overnight. Then her clients started jumping ship. I heard Maxitech pulled their contract, Travis mentioned over beers that weekend. That was her biggest account, wasn't it? I nodded, thinking about how proud she'd been landing that deal. How she'd celebrated by buying that designer handbag she'd been eyeing. Funny how things circle back. The local business community's a small pond, and news travels fast. By the following Tuesday, her office sat empty. That beautiful custom build she'd been so proud of, perched right on land she never should have touched. The notice of violation taped to the door looked especially stark against all that modern glass. I drove past it one evening, just as the sun was setting. Remember those old westerns where tumbleweeds blow through a ghost town? It felt like that, watching through my truck window. The sign she'd had custom made, Camilla Rourke Consulting. Your future, elevated, caught the last light like a bad joke. Some folks might have expected me to feel vindicated, maybe even happy. But mostly, I felt tired. The kind of tired that seeps into your bones after a long deployment, when you've done what needed doing, but the cost of it all sits heavy in your chest. One morning, I was grabbing coffee at Dale's Diner when I overheard two ladies at the counter talking about Brent. Seems he'd been spotted loading boxes into his car behind the law office late at night. His Mercedes was gone, replaced by some basic sedan. The mighty had fallen, and fallen hard. "Did you hear about his house?" one whispered. "Listed it yesterday. Way under market." I stirred my coffee, watching the cream make patterns in the dark liquid. Remembered how he'd sat across from me in that first meeting, so smug in his expensive suit, telling me I was lucky Camilla didn't take my truck. Now he was selling his house just to cover legal fees. The State Bar Association wasn't playing around. They'd opened investigations into every case Brent had handled in the past 5 years. Each day brought new revelations, new clients coming forward with stories of doctored documents and convenient mistakes. The man who'd built his reputation on being a shark was drowning in his own waters. As for Camilla, well, her carefully curated world was splintering like cheap veneer. The business coach who'd preached about authentic living was being exposed as anything but authentic. Her client list, her speaking engagements, her influencer partnerships, all gone. Those fancy networking events she used to dominate? Her name disappeared from every guest list. I caught a glimpse of her once, hurrying out of the courthouse after another hearing about the property violations. She looked smaller somehow, her designer clothes hanging on her frame like they belonged to someone else. Our eyes met for just a second before she looked away. In that moment, I saw something I recognized, the look of someone watching their world cave in. But I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. 2 months after the dust settled, I stood at the edge of my 4 acres, watching a bulldozer clear away the last remnants of Camilla's office building. The sound of crumbling drywall and splintering timber felt like therapy. Each crash was another piece of the past being swept clean. The settlement money had come through, enough to start fresh, and then some. I'd spent weeks sketching out plans on graph paper at Travis's kitchen table, measuring twice, dreaming once. The land had good bones, natural drainage, solid elevation, and just enough trees to break the wind without blocking the sunset. "You sure about this?" Travis had asked when I showed him the blueprints. "Could always invest it, maybe buy something already built." I shook my head, remembering my grandfather's hands rough with calluses from working his own spread. Some things you need to build yourself. The crew I hired was local, men who knew the soil and respected the work. We started with the foundation, pouring concrete in the cool morning hours before the Texas sun could bake us alive. Every evening, I'd walk the property line, checking progress, planning the next day's tasks. The familiar smell of fresh-cut lumber and wet earth brought back memories of helping my grandfather repair fence posts after spring storms. You ever notice how physical work has a way of clearing your head? There's something about the rhythm of it, lift, carry, measure, cut, that sets your mind right. Each day brought new progress, framework rising against the sky, walls taking shape, roof trusses reaching up like ribs. The barn came first, 40 feet of honest craftsmanship with room for equipment and maybe some horses down the line. We sided it in classic red because some traditions you don't mess with. Inside, I installed extra electrical outlets and good lighting. My grandfather always said a well-lit workspace was worth its weight in gold. Travis showed up most evenings after his shift, bringing either tools or beer, depending on what the job called for. He never asked for anything in return, just rolled up his sleeves and got to work. That's the thing about real friends. They show up without being asked. The gate was my pet project. I designed it myself. 2 solid posts of treated pine with wrought iron stretching between them. The metalwork wasn't fancy, just clean lines with a purpose. Above it, curved in steel letters I'd commissioned from a local craftsman, was the name I'd chosen, Valor Ridge. "Bit dramatic, don't you think?" Travis teased as we hung the last section. I tightened a bolt, feeling the metal secure under my wrench. "Nah, it's about standing your ground, doing what's right, even when it's hard." The house was modest but solid. 3 bedrooms, open kitchen, wraparound porch deep enough for a couple of rocking chairs. Every nail, every board, every decision felt like reclaiming something I'd lost. Or maybe finding something I never knew I needed. The day we raised the final roof beam, Travis brought over a 6-pack of the good stuff. The kind we used to splurge on back in high school when we had something worth celebrating. We sat on the tailgate of my truck, watching the sun paint the sky orange over my 4 acres. "Remember when you were sleeping on my couch?" Travis popped open 2 bottles, handed me one. "Look at you now, property owner." I took a long pull from the bottle, letting the cold beer wash down months of dust and sweat. The land stretched out before us, no longer a reminder of betrayal, but a promise of something new. The gate caught the last light, those steel letters standing proud against the dying day. "To Valor Ridge," Travis raised his bottle. "And to telling lawyers to kiss your ass." I laughed, really laughed, for what felt like the first time in ages. We clinked bottles, and I looked out over my kingdom of 4 acres. The barn's fresh paint glowed in the sunset. The house stood straight and true. And that gate was more than just an entrance. It was a declaration. The official letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, caught between ads and bills in my mailbox. The courthouse seal stood out against the cream-colored envelope, making my heart skip just like it had months ago when this whole mess started. But this time was different. This time, my hands were steady as I broke the seal. You know that moment when everything you've fought for finally becomes real? When all the sleepless nights and grinding determination actually pay off? That's what hit me as I unfolded that crisp piece of paper. The legal language was clear and final. Full ownership of the property confirmed, all prior claims nullified, Camilla's business filings officially void. The judge's signature stretched across the bottom like a victory flag. But what caught my eye was the small note paper clipped to the corner, handwritten in the judge's precise script. Justice served. Keep building. I had to sit down at my desk, letting the weight of it all sink in. The morning sun streamed through my office window, catching dust motes in its beam. From where I sat, I could see the barn through the window, its red paint bright against the Texas sky. The sight of it brought back the taste of that first beer with Travis when we'd finished the roof. Cold and clean and earned. The frame was already waiting in my desk drawer. I'd bought it weeks ago, knowing this day would come. Nothing fancy, just solid oak with clean lines, like everything else I'd built here. My grandfather's envelope, the one that started it all, was already mounted on the left side. I carefully positioned the court letter on the right, making sure the judge's note was visible. You ever notice how some objects carry more weight than their size should allow? That frame held more than paper and glass. It held a story of loss and redemption, of betrayal turned to victory. The kind of story my grandfather would have appreciated. Speaking of my grandfather, I could almost hear his voice as I hung the frame. A man's word is his bond, but sometimes you need paper to prove it. He'd been right about so many things. Right about keeping that envelope safe all those years. Right about building something of your own. The frame caught the light as I stepped back. Those two documents facing each other like bookends of a chapter in my life. One given in trust, one earned through fire. Together, they told a story that started with a punch to the gut and ended with, well, not exactly a happy ending. More like a just one. Travis stopped by later that afternoon, whistling when he saw the framed letters. "Man, that's something else," he said, leaning in to read the judge's note. "Guess you showed them what justice looks like, huh?" I nodded, remembering Brent's smug face that first day in my driveway. Funny how things work out. He thought he was serving me papers. Turns out he was just getting the ball rolling on his own downfall. The late afternoon sun slanted through the window, throwing long shadows across my desk. The frame caught the light just right, making both envelopes glow like they were lit from within. One old, one new. One given in love. One earned through grit. Looking at them side by side, I felt something settle in my chest. Not happiness exactly, but something steadier. Something that felt a lot like peace. The kind that comes from knowing you fought fair and won anyway. I touched the frame one last time, feeling the cool glass under my fingertips. Those two envelopes would stay there, reminding me daily of what I'd lost and what I'd earned back. Not just land or buildings, but something more valuable. My self-respect, my future, my right to build something of my own. The judge was right. Justice had been served, and I sure as hell planned to keep building. 3 months after the court ruling, I was fixing a loose board on the front porch when Travis's truck kicked up dust in my driveway. The look on his face told me something was up before he even killed the engine. "Hey, brother," he said, shuffling his feet. "Look, I wouldn't pass this along, but I figured you should know. Camilla reached out to Sarah last night." My jaw tightened. Sarah was Travis's wife, and she'd been friends with Camilla back when things were good. I kept working on the board, letting the hammer's rhythm steady my thoughts. She wants to talk, Travis continued. Says she's been doing some thinking. Wants to make things right. He paused. Sarah told her she'd pass along the message, but that's all. The morning sun beat down on my neck as I drove the last nail home. Funny how some memories stick with you. Like the day Camilla signed that clause about the land, how she'd laughed and said we'd build something beautiful here together. Now, here I was, building it alone. And you know what? That felt just fine. Nothing to talk about, I said, standing up and dusting off my jeans. The court said everything that needed saying. Travis nodded, relief crossing his face. That's what Sarah figured you'd say. She already told Camilla not to push it. Later that afternoon, I was checking my email when a news alert caught my eye. Brent Halverson had filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The article mentioned he'd sold his downtown office and was relocating to Houston. No mention of the disbarment or the fraud. Just another lawyer moving on to new opportunities. You might think I'd feel satisfaction, maybe even crack a smile. But all I felt was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm passes, when you're just grateful to be standing. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, the same kind my grandfather used to drink, strong enough to float a horseshoe, and headed outside. The late afternoon sun painted everything in gold, and the air carried that sweet Texas cedar smell that always reminded me of home. Walking the perimeter of my land had become a daily ritual. 4 acres might not sound like much, but when it's yours, really yours, every step matters. I passed the spot where Camilla's office used to stand, now cleared and seeded with native grass. The wind rustled through it like it was trying to erase old memories. About halfway around, I stopped at my favorite viewpoint. From there, I could see the whole spread. The barn with its fresh paint, the bunkhouse I'd just finished, the training area I was building out back. Each piece represented something earned, something honest. The idea hit me as I stood there, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. Maybe all this wasn't just for me. I thought about my time in the service, about the guys who came home looking for something solid to grab onto, someplace quiet to sort things out. That night, I sat at my desk and started sketching plans. The bunkhouse could house 6 comfortably. The barn's upper level could be converted into a meeting space. Add some training equipment, maybe a meditation garden. I could offer weekend retreats for veterans trying to find their footing back in civilian life. I pulled out my phone and called Martinez, a buddy from my last deployment who'd gotten into counseling work. "Hey man," I said when he picked up. "Got a proposition for you." 2 hours later, we had the bones of a plan. He'd help coordinate with the VA, get the word out through his network. I'd provide the space, the structure, the quiet. Together, we'd offer something more valuable than therapy sessions or workshops. We'd offer understanding. A place where the silence didn't feel empty. Looking at the plans spread across my desk, I felt something shift inside me. This land, this project, it wasn't just about winning anymore. It wasn't about Camilla or Brent or proving anything to anyone. It was about building something that mattered. The next morning, I woke before dawn and walked the property again. But this time, I wasn't just seeing what was. I was seeing what could be, where others would find peace, where they could rebuild, just like I had. The sun crested the horizon as I reached the front gate, painting the Valor Ridge sign in morning light. The air was cool and clean, filled with possibility. Everything around me, the land, the buildings, the silence, it all belonged to me now. But more importantly, it belonged to a purpose bigger than myself. I pulled out my phone and dialed Martinez again. Time to get to work. 6 months of sweat and sawdust had transformed Valor Ridge into something I barely recognized from those first bitter days. The fresh-cut lumber smell still hung in the air, as I walked the grounds, checking off my mental punch list. Every nail, every board, every decision, they all meant something now. You know that feeling when you're building something and suddenly it hits you? Not just what it is, but what it means. That's what got me as I stood there in the early morning light. The white fence stretched clean and straight along the property line, each post set true and solid. Behind it, the barn rose up proud against the Texas sky, its red paint catching the sunrise like it was built to greet each new day. Inside, we'd stocked everything needed for the veteran retreats: training equipment, meditation cushions, even a small library corner where guys could sit and decompress. "Looking good, Rourke," came Martinez's voice from behind me. He'd driven up early to help with the final touches before our first group arrived next week. "Hard to believe this is the same place." I nodded, remembering how the land had looked when I first reclaimed it. Camilla's abandoned office slowly rotting in the sun, paperwork scattered across the floor like dead leaves. Now that spot held our outdoor training area, with pull-up bars and heavy bags arranged in a neat circle. Nature had already started taking back the scarred earth, fresh grass pushing through where foundation once stood. The local paper had run a piece yesterday about Valor Ridge. "Veteran turns personal loss into community haven," the headline read. The reporter had been particularly interested in the framed envelope hanging behind my desk, that time-worn package my grandfather had handed me years ago, telling me I'd need it someday. If he could see how right he'd been. "Check this out," Martinez said, pulling up the article on his phone. There it was, front and center, a photo of that framed envelope, positioned right above my grandfather's old desk. Inside lay the deed, the property clause, and the match that had lit the fuse of justice. The caption read, "Sometimes salvation comes in unexpected packages." I had to smile at that. The reporter didn't know half of it. She didn't know about Brent's final humiliation as he packed up his downtown office, or how Camilla's carefully curated social media empire had crumbled into radio silence. Last I heard, she'd moved back in with her parents in Oklahoma. Funny how karma works sometimes. "First group gets here Monday," Martinez reminded me, pulling me back to the present. "You ready?" I looked around at what we'd built. The bunkhouse stood ready with fresh linens and warm lighting. The meditation garden caught the morning sun just right, making the new fountain sparkle. Even the sign at the front gate seemed to glow. Valor Ridge, in hand-routed letters, with "Finding Your Way Home" carved smaller underneath. "Yeah," I said, feeling the truth of it in my bones. "We're ready." We walked the perimeter one last time, checking gates and testing latches. Everything secure, everything in its place. The land that had cost me my marriage, my savings, my sense of security, it had given back something bigger, something lasting. The morning sun climbed higher as we finished up, casting long shadows across the training yard. Martinez headed out to make some calls, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I pulled out my grandfather's old pocket watch, another inheritance that had survived the storm, and checked the time. Almost 9. Walking back to the office, I passed under the main gate one more time. The sign caught the light just right. Those routed letters standing proud against the cedar board. I remembered Brent's smirk as he'd served me those papers, remembered Camilla's cold silence as she'd tried to take it all. Now their names were just footnotes in a story about rebuilding. I unlocked the office door and stepped inside, where that framed envelope hung like a battle flag behind my desk. Looking at it now, I couldn't help but smile and shake my head. The words just slipped out, quiet but certain. "Don't bet against a man with nothing to lose." I believe stories like this find us for a reason. If this one touched you, please subscribe. I share a new one every day. And tomorrow's might be the one your heart's been waiting for.